Good evening. I'm Alfred Hitchcock.
Or your Quran. Hey, we are doing our Hitchcock episode because the anniversary of North by Northwest. I am Alex from Los Angeles.
And I am Karen from Los Angeles, I guess. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We are two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but were both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. Join us as we explore why they matter to us before reviewing the three movies in their filmography that make the biggest impact on us.
Yeah, so as we mentioned in our last episode, this is a little bit different than what we're normally doing. Instead of covering a new movie, we're covering an old classic with a big anniversary happening. So today, we're talking about North by Northwest, one of the seminal films in film history, released on July 1st, 1959. So it's the 65th anniversary this year, basically just last month. And this gives us an excuse to also not only talk about a movie that both of us love and that is a Stone Cold classic, but also about one of our favorite directors, Alfred Hitchcock, the director of that film. And I thought he was here for a second when the episode started. Karan, you did such a good job impersonating him. I thought maybe we'd summoned his ghost back because sadly he's no longer with us. But why don't you start, Karan, just on your thoughts on Hitchcock? When did you first discover him? Why is he one of your favorite directors?
Yeah, I was trying to think back in my head of like when did I first discover him? And I really couldn't place it. And that's, I guess, testament to him because it feels to me that he's kind of been in my movie mind since the beginning of times, even though that is not true. Because I think a lot of people who've been listening to the podcast know that a lot of my love of film really started in, I want to say, the late 2000s, and then sort of really came into being in the 2010s, especially for like American movies.
Right.
And that's probably when I must have seen one of his movies end to end. But I mean, this is all stating the obvious. I feel like I this morning before like recording this episode, I was smiling to myself about this episode, and in a way that I feel so small, like even talking about him because everything has been said. But at the same time, there's a smile to it because that's what Hitchcock is to me, which is that he's cheeky. He makes movies that everybody can love. They have so many layers to them. At the same time, I associate a lot of deep psychology and particularly elements of dread or fear or thrill, sex, desire. It's the darker side of humanity, I think, that he really explores. And I think to me, that is the perfect kind of movie where it's fun, it has an amazing premise, it's beautifully made technically and performed, but then also has something deeper to say about. And sometimes that balance of, I guess, psychology and what's on screen doesn't always work in Hitchcock's case, like in anyone's case, but the batting average here is probably the highest amongst anybody. And I think that is why we all love him so much and what he's given to us through his movies. And I'll pass the mic back to you. But the other thing I was thinking of was that look at the longevity of this career. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this person started making movies in the what, late 20s, early
Early
30s,
20s, early 20s
early
silent era.
20s. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's insane
Yeah, up to the
to
late
be
70s. Yeah.
yeah, to be relevant for this long, and you really see his progression. He's had so many eras of kind of reinventing himself to the point that I think he becomes a bit of a meme, a
Mm-hmm.
self meme, I think. And maybe to some degree that worked, but it's interesting to kind of chart his whole career from the beginning of times. So yeah, I mean, how can you, I was going to say, be a movie lover and not know or be enamored by Hitchcock, but I will correct that and say, how can you be living on the planet and not be touched by him? Because not only is it's his movies, I mean, every movie that we've seen since that has any of those elements that I touched on, they all owe it to Hitchcock. Because
Mm-hmm.
any person that you think of today, steal a page from his book. What is your relationship to Hitchcock, and what do you think of first when you think of Hitchcock?
Yeah, it's similar to you in that I can't really remember not knowing that he existed.
Yeah.
Even as a young child, he was one of the few directors I knew of, and not only knew of in terms of a name, because I knew Spielberg, like I grew up in the 80s. I loved movies. I knew Steven
Hmm.
Spielberg and George Lucas because I love Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But not any of the older directors. I mean, when you're 8 or 9, you don't know who Truffaut is or John Ford or any of the old masters because you're just too
Mm.
young. But Hitchcock, not only because of the movies are very successful, but he leaned into his own brand. Like the
Right.
TV show would air on Nick at Night, and he would host at the beginning of every episode. He would be in it. So I knew what he looked like. I knew what he sounded like. When you go to the video store, you'd see the VHS tapes of all the Hitchcock movies, and they'd always have his little silhouette. Like he created that
Mhm.
logo for himself. Like what director would have done that? I mean, now, yeah, sure, stuff happens all the time. But back then in like the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, he leaned in to it. He was on posters of his own movies, which is
Yeah.
crazy and unheard of. So as a kid, I not only then was understanding, oh, this is a guy, he directed these movies, but he was one of the directors. There's a couple of them that really helped me understand, like, oh, that's what directors are. Like his movies, at least the ones that I knew when as a young child, like the big 50s hits, like a Psycho and The Birds, Rear Window. It was like, okay, horror and suspense. Like that is his style. So then it started helping me understand, oh, like directors actually can have a style. Oh, this is interesting. It's not just the actors and the story, which when you're a kid, at least for me, that's what I thought movies were. I didn't really know what directors did. So he was one of the first ones to kind of help me understand that. And then when I went off to film school, I took a Hitchcock class taught by a great professor who had a PhD in Hitchcock studies. It was
Hmm.
awesome. Like it's a huge theater, so I saw all these movies for the first time in a theater, and it really helped me too, Hitchcock, understand the auteur theory, which is this theory in film studies that a movie is really just one person's vision, even though thousands of people can make a movie. I mean, you sit through some of these credits, and it's like goes on for 10 minutes. So there's a lot of people involved, but really it's kind of one person's vision, which is a theory. I mean, some people feel it's not accurate, but especially after taking that class, I really did understand. No, like directors are the main creative forces behind a movie. At least how I view it. So he helped
Hmm.
me there understanding film theory through Hitchcock's and obviously his movies are great too. Some of my favorite movies of all time. You know, like you said, he invented genres that we still use today. The slasher movie, the spy adventure movie, the
Hmm.
globe-trotting kind of fun adventure where it's not really, that serious, even though there's stakes. He was inventing like large set pieces that wasn't done before, big action set pieces in all of his movies that are memorable. I mean, I think he's not my favorite director of all time. That's Stanley Kubrick, and maybe we'll get to him at some point, but he's number two, and arguably maybe is
Right.
the best director of all time in terms of his influence on film. Even if like I totally agree with you, people that never seen his movies still feel his influence because if you go
Right.
to a movie today, you're basically feeling Hitchcock's influence in some way, either on the
Right.
business end, like I said, with the brand of leaning into like some of the movies that we watch on this podcast, I was noticing in the credits, Alfred Hitchcock's. Then it says the title of the
Hmm.
movie, not like a film by or directed by. It's like his name is as big as the titles,
Oh
so
yeah.
he knew what he was doing. And this is all
I
obviously
mean, most of his movies start with him in it, making a little
the
cameo, which is
that's
sort of a
yes.
fun gag, but it's such a,
Hmm.
iconography clearly was very important to him from the very beginning.
That's a fun point too. I even remember as a child because my parents would tell me, "Oh yeah, it's Hitchcock, and he's in all of his movies." So they'd maybe be watching an older movie, and I liked older movies, but I would prefer kind of more new ones. But I'd sit down in front of the Hitchcock ones, like, "Oh, maybe I can find him." It's like a Where's Waldo thing. Like it's exciting as a kid to be like, "I know he's going to be in here somewhere," and then you see him, you're like, "Oh, that's cool." Like it makes it kind of fun, which movies should be
Right.
fun. And as a child, like an interesting for a kid, I think he's a good sort of first, baby's first director kind of thing. At least he was for me. I'll say it like that. I think he felt like that, even though his subject matter, to your point, is
Right.
obviously not, kid friendly at all. But a lot of that is, I think, buried under the surface. So the movie
Yeah.
seems fun. As a kid, you don't understand actually really what's going on. And the more I got to know him as a man and through the Hitchcock class too, like he had some dark stuff he was dealing with and the themes of his mother in like every movie and
Right.
religion and like homosexuality. It's like everything is in all these themes are in every single one of his movies, and it's just really interesting to see that. Which, and as a kid, you have no idea. Like, oh, there he is.
Right.
Or, oh, the birds are attacking people. Like, this is cool, but you
Yeah.
don't really realize what's going on. That's what makes him a master too. He can do both. Play to both the smartest and the dumbest people in the room.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's
No,
the best.
no one like him, really.
Why don't we then get into the first movie that we're talking about, which is the anniversary of North by Northwest? So this is a movie, like I said, that came out in 1959, so 65 years ago. The IMDb plot summary: a New York advertising executive goes on the run after being mistaken for a government agent by a group of foreign spies and falls for a woman whose loyalties he begins to doubt. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Cary Grant, Eve Marie Saint, and James Mason. We talked about this movie previously in another
Yep.
episode, so I'll post a link to that down below. You talked about it before. Why don't you kick off our discussion now on North by Northwest?
Yeah, and I was very lucky to actually watch this movie on the big screen a few weeks ago because it was
Oh,
playing at the
wow.
Aero in Santa Monica,
Was that
which
the
was,
70 millimeter presentation
yeah,
too?
it
Oh
was
man.
amazing.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I've seen it in 70 before. It's brilliant. If folks haven't seen it in theaters, all these movies actually you got to see in
all
the
these
theater. It
movies.
makes
Yeah,
all the difference. But
yeah,
I'm jealous. I did not see it in the theaters this time.
yeah, it was amazing. I mean, this movie on the surface is probably the most fun movie. Everything we know and think about the Bond franchise or, any sort of spy thriller movie, it owes everything to this movie. This movie invented that genre pretty much.
Hmm.
But I think the brilliance of the movie is that yes, it's so fun and you're on this wild goose chase and not a lot of it even coherently hangs together. You don't even really understand much of it, but you're in for the ride and all the set pieces and all the gags. And of course, Cary Grant at his charming best in that
Oh yeah.
incredible suit, running around, James Mason being his over the top, amazing baddie, and then Eva Marie Saint, in the long lineup of blonde ice queens in Hitchcock movies, doing her thing. But the brilliance of the movie is essentially that, which is that it actually doesn't fully make sense, and that is why every time I come back to it, I'm like, oh, I didn't actually remember that this had happened, or I couldn't describe the plot of this movie to you. And I've been thinking a lot about that in Hitchcock's context because I feel that way about a lot of his movies. Of course, Vertigo being the pinnacle of that because you don't even know what happened.
Right.
And at first I was like, is this a fluke of North by Northwest? And then you start to see that actually, no, this is by design because it comes up a lot in a lot of his movies. Some of his movies are very straightforward and you understand it and you know what the plot is. You could easily summarize the plot of Rear Window in one sentence. But
Hmm.
I don't know if you can do that with a lot of his other movies. And this is exactly that, which again is such a genius because a fun, kind of thrilling spy kind of movie should be simple and straightforward, but it isn't. And that's why you keep coming back to it. And then every time you come back to it, you obviously understand a little bit more, only to forget it, but you sort of relish in the beauty of it, the aesthetics and the mid-century modernness. And that's why this was a comfort movie to me, because of those factors. But
Hmm.
even though all of this thrilling action is taking place, because a lot of it just doesn't make sense, you can just enjoy, lay back and enjoy. So I don't know. He's such a master manipulator, I think, of audiences that he
Hmm.
tricks you every time. And I think this is at the pinnacle of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's the formula of this type of movie that is then copied, for decades afterwards, is that there is a MacGuffin, which
Yeah.
is sort of the thing that in this movie, it's this microfilm that is stolen in the, I mean, again, I'm even trying to remember exactly how the
Right.
microfilm
You
fits in it.
don't.
There's microfilm they're trying to get. And Hitchcock knows that no one cares. It doesn't matter. As long
Yeah.
as you can use that as an excuse to put Cary Grant in danger, put him in a cornfield where he's getting shot at, put him on the side of Mount Rushmore, put him at the UN where he accidentally stabbed a guy. Like those are the things you remember. Those are the things you care about. The plot doesn't really matter. And he doesn't get caught up in these mechanics of like what is exactly going on because like
Hmm.
that's not interesting to the audience. Especially in these types of movies, these spy movies, it doesn't really matter. It's like, what's the spy doing? Is he or she going to get caught? What's the big action scene that's happening? And that is why this movie is so brilliant and why I think it's been copied. This formula of like, don't get too caught up in the plot. There's something they're trying to get. I mean, the entire Mission Impossible movie franchise
Right.
basically owes to this movie, but to Hitchcock too. Like, there's always a thing they have to get. But it doesn't matter, and you sort
It
of
doesn't
lose
matter
track
what the
of it.
thing
It's just,
is.
is Tom Cruise hanging off this thing? Cool. Like he can run through this? Great. Like I don't really care what's happening. And this movie does that so well because all the rest of the elements are so interesting. you don't care and it doesn't bother you. It's not like a mystery movie where you're trying to like put the pieces together like a Sherlock Holmes kind of thing and the plot is the most important thing. Now he's done a couple of those movies to your point too,
Mm-hmm.
but this type of I don't know what you call this. Like it is a spy movie. It's an adventure movie. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a Hitchcock adventure. You know, it's like I have to use his name to basically describe the genre of this. But I think that is what makes this movie one of the many reasons that does make it so brilliant. And I don't know. Again, we're not film scholars, so I can't say if this is the first time something like this has been done. But I think he's popularized that of like the MacGuffin. That's like his big thing.
Right.
It's just MacGuffins in movies, and he knows it's dumb and it doesn't really need to make sense, and just you kind of move on from it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like, how difficult is that, Because there are many MacGuffin movies, but there's something about the mise en scène or the overall orchestration of the movie that even though they're trying to make it not about the MacGuffin, you can't help but not overly think about it. And then you get confused because
Hmm.
they're making, they're trying to underline it, but also not underline it. And that's a very confusing experience. And many Mission Impossible movies are like that in my mind, the
Mm.
ones that don't fully hit kind of the perfect tone. Of course, now they've kind of totally got it. With North by Northwest, it's the whole package, right? Like from the locations to the costuming to how every actor shows up. And we should sort of talk about that with Hitchcock. He's famously treated his actors like furniture or cattle or what have you. And I think this is a great example where the actors are sort of showing up in their superstar molds and kind of bringing who they are. And that's like another kind of meta-ness because we know these people as their screen personas kind of off screen, and then that's sort of what you're seeing, and that kind of adds like a whole bunch of great texture to the movie. Again, it feels like by design that he did that with his actors, which I'm sure was frustrating for some of them and didn't always work. But I think Cary Grant is probably the best. I mean, I guess it's between him and Jimmy Stewart, really. But
Right. Yeah.
I,
Or
I
James.
still
Yeah.
prefer Cary Grant in his movies because I think his charm and off-screen, on-screen persona lends itself so beautifully to all these movies. And you need that anchor point, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, you will be thinking about the MacGuffin. You will be concerned about the plot, but you're not because you're on for the ride through the set pieces, through the costumes, through the locations, and through these amazing superstar actors. And then just I have to say the style quotient of this movie, if that's an official term, I just coined it. It's just up the charts.
Hmm.
Like every frame of it, what these people are wearing, every look, every piece of furniture, that whole mansion or home that they live in,
Mount Rushmore,
Mount
or the
Rushmore. I
one.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
amazing. That
Beautiful.
whole place. Like yeah, I want that. But
Yeah.
see, that's the thing, right? Like in a movie like this, you could almost say, oh, yeah, I don't care about this, but you're in for the ride the moment the Saul Bass iconography and credit sequence kicks in. You know exactly this is going to be a thrill ride. And you're kind of elevated, from like a style and visual. Yeah, you need all that. Otherwise, you would be distracted by the plot and you'd be overthinking about it.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think Cary Grant is amazing in this movie, and it's funny too because one of the things that Hitchcock does in a lot of his movies are takes like the ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances, which
Right,
is the plot of this, right? But the fact that you buy into to Cary Grant as an ordinary man who is,
right,
obviously he's not like the famous quote that he even said, "Oh, I wish I was Cary Grant," was a famous quote Cary Grant said because no one
right,
exists as perfect as him. But in this movie, he is like just an everyday ad executive, handpicked by his mother. Like and now he's thrown into this international conspiracy and what's going on, and he doesn't know. And I think that you need an actor with that kind of presence and, to your point, persona to bring the audience along so you're not thinking about, wait a second, who is this person again? Why are they trying to get Cary Grant here? It's more just like, oh my God, what's going to happen to Cary Grant next? And the other thing that I think
right,
Hitchcock does so brilliantly in most of his movies, but this one especially, is they could have in the narrative not told the audience what was going on for until the very end when Cary Grant finds out, oh, wait a second, like they think that I'm this other guy and there's a microfilm and the government knows about it and there's this fake identity. But Hitchcock tells you, like, in almost like in the first 15 minutes, it cuts to a scene where the government explains basically the plot of the movie to the audience right away. So it removes the mystery, but it leaves the suspense. And I think Hitchcock
Right.
is brilliant at not getting caught up in mystery, because a mystery is something the audience doesn't know. Suspense is something the audience knows it. Maybe the characters don't, but you want to see how it plays out. He has a famous
Mhm.
quote at one point about, like, yeah, you can have a bomb be in a cafe and the audience doesn't know, and all of a sudden a bomb goes off and the audience is surprised. But what's better is the audience knows there's a bomb there, and you're sitting there being, oh my God, all these people don't know. And like, when's it going to go off and what's going to happen? And that's Hitchcock. And he understands the difference between it. And that's, I think, also why, as we're unpacking this, the MacGuffin stuff, it doesn't matter, because I kind of, you're not wondering what's going on. They tell you, even though it kind of doesn't make sense, but it's like, okay, movie, at least, like you've said, there's this other, character who is a fake made up spy name, and the government knows about it, but they don't care. And you're like, okay, great. Plot check. Okay, what's going to happen? What suspenseful scene is getting put in next? I think that is just the brilliance of how Hitchcock constructs these movies, even though he doesn't write them. I mean, he wrote some of his very early films,
Right.
but he's not a screenwriter. But he's such a major creative force in these films in that way, that I think that is what makes him so special and often imitated, never duplicated.
So well said. And yeah, that's his brilliance. Nobody else can do it this way. And it all feels very effortless. That's the other thing, you
Hmm.
know. I feel like people have tried to do this, but it feels very heavy-handed. And this just feels like, oh, this is how it just is supposed to be.
Yeah, the other thing that really stood out to me on this rewatch, which I've seen this movie, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. I've
Yeah.
seen it probably over a dozen times, is the way that he sets up these set pieces and constructs them. Where there's two sort of big ones, the scene at the end on Mount Rushmore, and then the scene in the cornfield. And like, Cary Grant gets dropped off in the middle of the field. He's supposed to meet a guy. The audience knows that. He establishes that it's empty. He cuts to like crop dusters. So he's setting up the elements for the audience. And then it eventually kind of all come together when Cary Grant is chased through the cornfield. So it's not like a surprise, like, where'd this plane come from? What's happening? He sets everything up and makes it build where you're like, okay, nothing's happening.
Hmm.
What's going on? Something's got to happen. I know he keeps kind of these wide shots. So like, are we supposed to see something? Oh, there's a person
Hmm.
over there. What's, like, you're always on the edge of your seat. And in the Mount Rushmore sequence, I noticed it more on this rewatch too. They put Mount Rushmore in the background of so many shots where it's like, it's there, it's there, it's
Yeah.
there. And then all of a sudden it just gets bigger as they get closer to it. And then now they're dangling on it. It's part of the set piece. But he establishes that and sort of is teasing you with, like, whoa, they're in Mount Rushmore. Like, is something going to happen? That's like a very, very famous landmark in the United States. And it's like building the suspense leading up to the set piece. And that is something that I think he does really well. But in this movie, especially, he does is like the best example of that. And really, a lot of these elements we were talking about, the Hitchcock blonde is a typical thing he puts in here. I think that also, this is the pinnacle of that. Or a character with issues with his mother. I mean, maybe you could argue Psycho's probably the pinnacle of that, but
Right.
in this one, like, the mom shows up and she's there. She's not just talked about. Like, his themes are here, and I think just he's nailing them in the most perfect way with this movie. That's why I think it's sort of the ultimate Hitchcock film in that sense.
The mother is like literally the same age and looks even younger than Cary Grant.
I
This time I
know.
really noticed and I was like, what is going on over here? It's
Well,
hilarious.
I mean, that's got, maybe that means something
That means
in
something
terms of
too.
for Hitch and his mom. Again, I don't know the specifics of what that relationship was like, but it clearly was something. In the same way, like Spielberg, and it's always everything's about his dad.
Right.
Hitchcock had something going on with his mom, because every movie there's like a mother character in here that's overbearing or annoying, or hating
Yeah.
on the son, and so who knows? Oh, maybe only he knows kind of
Yeah.
what that was all about. But yeah, I also want to call out too the score in this
I
movie.
was just gonna say, yeah.
Yeah, do you want to start on that? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why the music composer is, I think, the second last, the third last credit, right
Hmm.
before Hitchcock's name in every movie, because it tells you how important that is to him. And it shows in every movie, but this movie especially, like that main theme is absolutely iconic. Everything that you've been saying and we've been saying about the build up, you cannot build up without that score.
Hmm.
And that's the thing, right? Like, it's a beautiful melody, you can listen to it and get excited about it, it's just beautifully constructed, but it is a true character in the movie, and it plays with the audience. Because I think that's the thing, like, Hitchcock is cheeky, he's always like titillating and playing with the audience with the wide shots or putting these little seeds, and I think the score really taps into that. Plus, it just sounds very slick and stylish as well. Like, you could have a great melody that taps into, the build up, but doesn't sound so cool and slick. And this one doesn't. It totally lives up. It looks like it was written now. It's
Absolutely.
timeless.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's my favorite. Bernard Herrmann, who's a composer,
Yeah,
and Hitchcock collaborating on a couple films. To me, this is, I think, the best
it's the best.
version of their collaboration because of all the things you mentioned. I mean, I listen to the score a lot, even though it gets me too excited sometimes. Like, I can't just relax when I listen to it. I'm like, oh my God, what's gonna happen to me? Is someone gonna, come in here and attack me or whatever? But it's a great score that stands on its own, but with the film just elevates everything even more, which I think are some of the best scores do that. They're great pieces of music, but they're in very important, crucial parts of the film. Whereas if you remove it, like the suspense is definitely gonna be dialed down.
Yeah. Oh, what a movie.
Yeah, what a movie. Yeah,
And
if folks haven't seen it, like definitely, you won't be able probably to be as lucky as Karan to see it in 70 millimeter in a theater, but highly recommend checking this movie out. I do think it holds up in the sense of it still feels very modern because so many modern movies crib from it. Where even though, yeah, it's from 65 years ago, I think it still has enough of a power over an audience that a kid today could watch it. I mean,
oh,
I saw this
totally.
as a young kid and it enthralled me, at like 10 or 12. So I think it
Yeah.
still holds up.
I mean, the pacing of it is so critical to that. And then what you're saying about the mystery and the thrill of it, and that's why you keep coming back to it. Because if you knew what happened, you wouldn't come back to it. Or if you were watching it for the first time, and like we've been saying, you wouldn't get too caught up in what's happening. It's just a joyride.
Hmm.
So it doesn't matter how you come at it, you're going to have a good time. And that's why this movie is timeless, and excited that we got a chance to talk about this in this context of its anniversary.
Okay, so that was North by Northwest. So now we're going to move on to the rest of our show, and this is where we bring in our top threes. So just to remind listeners or let new listeners know, we're going to start with our first love, and this is the movie that made us first fall in love with this. In this case, Hitchcock, or left a big impression on us. Then we're going to get to the masterpiece. This is the movie that we feel it would be Hitch's masterpiece for us, like which resonates the most with us. And then finally, the wild card, and this could really be anything, just another important Hitchcock film, whether it was a film that he tried something new and it didn't work or a film that is maybe overlooked in his filmography that we feel is something that needs to be discussed more. So, Karan, why don't we start with you and your first love of Alfred Hitchcock? What do we got for us?
All right. So my first love is Rear Window from 1954, directed, of course, by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Jimmy Stewart, Grace Kelly, Thelma Ritter. Quick logline: a house and wheelchair bound photographer, his fashion model girlfriend, and his visiting nurse spy on neighbors from his courtyard window. Despite skepticism by his private eye detective friend, they're convinced one of his neighbors is the murderer. So I think this is probably the first movie that I could think of that I watched of his kind of from start to finish. And you're instantly sort of raptured and captured in just like the conceit of the movie. Because it's such a clever conceit. Everybody can relate to that in some form or the other, that you're in your home and you're, depending on who you are and how you see the world, your level of curiosity in terms of what is happening with your neighbors might vary, but everybody has a little bit of that.
Hmm.
And this is sort of dialed up to the highest degree, especially in this kind of a setup where the set that they built up, where you literally can see every window in front of you across different floors. And then once again, the premise is so clever because the lead character in Jimmy Stewart has had an accident of some sort. So he's homebound, he's wheelchair bound. So he's
Hmm.
there and there's nothing else to do. And I think we all felt this even more so in the pandemic era where we were all stuck up
Right.
and this is the life we were living vicariously through other people. And on the surface, there's fun in that. And as I said earlier, there's like a titillating quality to that, oh, what are you going to see? Are you going to have an in on people's fights and romances and, somebody taking their clothes off or what have you, right? Like there's all of that varies. But then you end up sort of noticing or discovering something that's darker, and what does that do to your mind? And I think that's what this movie is about, really, is that how much of that dark thing that you're seeing is really true, or is this something that's in your head that's coming out? and it plays with that in that dimension. But then it's Hitchcock, right? So it's not just going to be about that. There's so many layers to the movie that in the girlfriend character, like the more I watch this movie, I feel like this movie is actually Grace Kelly's movie, because
Mm.
she's the one who goes through a transformation where she's trying to, catch Jimmy Stewart's attention. First of all, I'm like, look at Grace Kelly. I mean, how could you not? I mean, she just is incredible in this movie.
Yeah, I think this just I think of screen performances from a female in film history. I feel like this might be the hottest anyone's ever looked in a movie, at least in the top two for me. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just absolutely stunning.
I
Which
would
is part of the
agree.
joke, I think, that he
It's
literally
part of
doesn't
the
care
joke.
about her when she's like the most perfect woman that has ever been placed in front of a
It's
of a
like,
of a man.
yeah, it's like 100 on a scale of a 10 or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, and he
It's
still is like,
just,
you're annoying. Get out of
yeah.
here.
But then something really fun happens where she leaps out and becomes the part of the whole action that everyone is witnessing, including Jimmy Stewart, and everything changes. And this is once again like it's so meta in that way that first of all you're eavesdropping, second of all you want to help, but do you really want to help, or are you just in for the fun ride to really dip your toes into the action, like what is really happening over here? So like I said in the beginning, like this is a fun ride that you can just sit in your own living room and watch this movie, or you can play with the deep psychology of once again what we desire, how we see ourselves and how we see each other. And the last thing I would say is just like relationship between men and women, which again is at play in most of Hitchcock's movies. And this is another perfect example of that, like the push pull between the two of them that continues throughout the movie. So yeah, this is one of his masterpieces, I think, and once again a gift that just keeps giving on every rewatch. What is your relationship with Rear Window?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said. I mean, this is a masterpiece, and we have a masterpiece category in this, obviously in our format. But there's like probably literally like five or six 10 out of 10
Exactly.
movies that he's made. This is I definitely agree is one of them. Yeah, I this is a movie that I saw early on in my sort of exploration of his filmography. Like I saw this before I took the Hitchcock class. Like it was such an easy kind of log line or high concept as a kid. You're like, oh, a guy's looking across and sees like a murder, and what does he do? So like as a young teenager, like this appealed to me and I watched it and loved it back then. But the more and more I see it, the more and more I can appreciate the movie. Before I get into sort of what I think kind of the thesis of the movie is, I definitely can relate to Jimmy Stewart's desire, and maybe this is something that Hitchcock's trying to say about humans, right? The desire to be like that voyeur and to look and
Mm-hmm.
like how much do you want to get involved. And when I was a freshman in college, my dorm looked onto another dormitory that was all just windows on the other side. Actually, they weren't, it was just the entire side of that dorm. Each apartment was just like a glass panel. So at night or whatever, I'd be doing homework and I could just look over to the left and look at what everyone was doing and see what was going on. And I kind of got to know, not know them, but kind of learn who these people were over the course of the year. And I remember one night it was late and I was working and I look over and I see there no one's there. It's all dark. And there's like a candlelight in the room. And I was like, oh, that's like not good. Like it's kind of dangerous. And then 5 minutes later, I look over and it's brighter. I'm like, that's weird. And then the wall was on fire. And and I didn't do anything because I was so involved in watching what was happening. I felt like a
Mm,
voyeur and I watched the fire grow. I watched the looked in the rest of the building to see if anyone else is in there. There's only a couple students like in their rooms doing homework and stuff because then it's like I think it was like 1:30 or whatever. I had a paper I was trying to work on. So I watched the fire alarms go on. I watched the firemen kind of get there, run through the hallways, go into the room. And I was so stuck in this, like, I'm just the watcher. I can't call 911, even though, yes, I definitely should have. This is bad. Like, I immediately should have called the fire department because I saw the fire start. But I felt like separated from this because I was so used to like I'm just watching a movie. These aren't real people and real lives going on. It's just for my entertainment. I was used to that for so many months that I felt like I couldn't act, which is sort of, I think, a lot of what Jimmy Stewart struggles with in this
yeah.
movie too. Like, I mean, yeah, he's wheelchair bound. How much do I want to get involved in this, and how much do I feel connected to these lives, or am I putting myself at a distance because I'm feeling like I'm just watching, these lives as little plays or little
Yeah,
television shows, each individual one. So I definitely lived through something where I every
that's
time I see this
amazing.
movie, I think back to that fire that I definitely should have called 911.
No,
100%. Like no one got hurt or anything,
no one got
luckily.
hurt, at least. Yeah.
And if I was seeing like a murder like in this movie, hopefully I would have actually done something and not just
Well,
been
or
so, I
you're
don't know.
not the Grace Kelly of this story,
You're right. You're
You
right. I'm not.
didn't want to jump in. So,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's that.
Yeah. Yeah, but in terms of the film, I kind of view this as Hitchcock's or maybe one of his, but I think it's him, it's a seminal comment on like movie making. Who is he as an artist? And first of all, Stewart's in a chair looking through a lens, so sort of like the Hitchcock, the director role. And there's everyday lives going on in all these apartments, and they're normal stuff. Like the one woman's working out. There's a woman who, can't get a date, the musician, the young couple, and it's just boring life, just normal, everyday, boring stuff. But Hitchcock inserts something like a murder, something exciting, because everyday life is boring. And why would anyone people wouldn't want to watch that. They want something exciting. So Jimmy Stewart, like kind of at first you think he might be inventing something, but obviously, yes, it's Hitchcock movie, so it turns out to be real. But I think this to me bubbles up to one of Hitchcock's like philosophies on film, that film can never give you reality. Reality is reality. It's going to be filtered through a lens of an artist anyway, so you might as well make it interesting. The quote that he had was, films aren't a slice of life, they're a slice of cake, right? Life, they can't give you life, so you got to give us something interesting instead. So I kind of view this movie as all those other stories. Yeah, they're cool. And like Jimmy Stewart's looking at him, but he needs to, with his own imagination, heighten the reality of these everyday lives that are going on in this apartment building by inserting this drama of the murder. And then obviously it has to be real because it's actually a movie and we're the audience being entertained. But I see this as something that could be a reflection of Hitchcock's thesis, just because it's so obviously a comment on audience members watching things and directors, and he's
Hmm.
directing like Grace Kelly at one point from the phone, like, go over here, look at this, look over there,
Hmm.
much like a director sitting at a chair. So I see this movie as Hitchcock kind of putting his own viewpoints on movie making and what his style is, at least. I mean, it's not like every movie has to be this. So I personally like movies that are more interesting than the mundane stuff. But Hitchcock definitely didn't believe in the mundane is interesting enough to warrant like a movie. So that every time I see this movie, I just think not only about the fire that I should have called in, but about sort of like Hitchcock's thesis on filmmaking, or his films, I should say, is definitely
Right.
that.
I think it's true. At the same time, I think he paints a pretty rich sort of tapestry, I think, because if it were just about the murder and the drama of it, I don't think it'll hang or land on us or on Jimmy Stewart in that way. It lands because it is juxtaposed with the ordinary lives and the day to day of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you're so invested. And even though nothing is happening in those other windows, you do want to see, and at some point you are scared for the woman who doesn't get a date, and you are sad for
Yeah.
her when she's sitting on her own. Or
Mm-hmm.
so all to me it's a different take. Like all those stories matter actually, and there's enough in there where at least I'm curious about the musician guy. Like, what is his life? Like, I would totally watch a movie about all of those people.
The Rear
But
Window
then,
extended universe. That's what you want to see.
exactly. Oh,
Actually, I'm sure someone's pitched that. That's not a bad idea, honestly. We should get
yeah,
Universal on the phone.
probably. But I think it works because all that is interesting, and then you throw something else in there, and it doesn't even have to be a murder. It could have been something else. I'm sure they were playing with all sorts of stories with all of those other people. So to me, that's what I take, that it's a rich tapestry. And you see that in all of Hitchcock's movies, that there is maybe a MacGuffin or like a central conceit or what have you, but it's a rich textured kind of put together thing. Otherwise he wouldn't care about the mise-en-scène. It'll just be about the shock. He does care about all the other elements that come together.
It's another case like in North by Northwest of the ordinary in the extraordinary.
Yeah.
Like the rest of that entire apartment building is just nothing, nothing, just all ordinary lives. But there's that one thing that is different, which is a murder's taking place, and that's extraordinary. And same thing with Jimmy
Yeah.
Stewart's like just bored and nothing's going on in his life, but there's that one extra thing that again you think maybe he's inventing it, but obviously he isn't. And I've seen this movie a couple times in the theater for my class, and then also just when it plays sometimes here in LA. And this it still works so well with the
Oh
audience.
yeah.
Whereas every time during the scene when the bad guy Jimmy Stewart's looking through his binoculars, I think, or his camera, I can't remember which one it is, and the bad guy finally like realizes he's being watched and looks up and looks directly at him, like directly at the camera. Like every time in that plays in a theater, like people gasp because
Yeah.
like oh my God, like he sees him, and like it's still this movie still just works so well on that level in terms of getting that suspense feeling out of the audience because you know that Jimmy Stewart's looking and you know
Right.
that this guy is now dangerous. But now what's going to happen? So there's that tension there of like, is he going to get Grace Kelly? She's in the room. Jimmy Stewart can't go and help her. So he's setting up all those elements, and that's the suspense piece that is just he's a master of suspense. I know that's what he's known for, but
Yeah.
it's like you can't help but just appreciate how well he constructs that and sets that stuff up. And just to see it still work on modern audiences today, that even every time I see this movie, I'm just like, oh my God, he's looking just the
Yeah.
way that when he looks over, you're like, oh crap, now what's gonna happen? Even though I know what's gonna happen because I've seen the
Right.
movie like a dozen times, but just still so excellent.
Yeah, you still gasp. But I think, like we've been saying, like, but there's depth there too, because the more you watch the movie over and over, you
Hmm.
start to then think about what is where the murder happens, like what is this relationship? What is this marriage? And then you start to piece back things because she's always in the bed and maybe she's not happy, or maybe she's being annoying. Not that she should be killed for it, but
Right,
there's
right.
more there,
Hmm.
but it's never spelled out fully. There's enough for you to care. Otherwise, again, if this were just about the extraordinary shock value, you wouldn't care. You wouldn't come back to it. And that's
Right.
why this movie is a masterpiece, because
Hmm.
it is juxtaposed with layers and depth, and then yeah, it's what's happening on the screen but also in the living room.
Right. Right.
And at some point the tables turn because the people from the screen come into the living room,
Right.
and that's another layer. When he comes over, the bad
Oh
guy,
yeah, yeah.
you're terrified. Absolutely. What's going to happen? Have they gone too far in their
Hmm.
quest of curiosity and eavesdropping, or are they really trying to help? Who
Hmm.
knows?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And also something that this relates to North by Northwest as well, and actually Hitchcock is good at this too, is just when the movie's done, it's done. They don't need to drag anything out. Like
No.
once you realize he's the murderer, he goes over, he attacks Jimmy Stewart, and then just like the movie's just over. It's like, okay, the plot's done. Like we don't need to continue to drag this out. And in North by Northwest too, we don't even really get to see how everyone gets captured. The movie just kind of ends. And again, I like that. He's like, look, this at this point, it just I'm giving you boring stuff that there's no suspense there. It just
Right.
wrap. I don't need to wrap it up. It's done. Boom,
Yeah.
over. And I also just love the end of this movie too, when you talk about character development and Grace Kelly. She's isn't exciting enough for Jimmy Stewart. So at
Yeah.
the end, she goes over there and joins in the adventure. So maybe you think their relationship's gonna be better. And she's reading that adventure catalog, and then she's like, you know what? No, I'm just gonna go back and read the fashion catalog. Like,
Right. I love
even though I think
that.
she's even wearing like some sort of, she's not in the dress, I don't think anymore at the end. Maybe, or maybe the cover of the magazine, the first one has like woman in like adventure boots or whatever. Like, oh, okay, maybe now they're gonna be fine. And then she's like, nah, you're not gonna change me, Jimmy Stewart. Like, I still want to just be and look at the glamour mag. I love that how it ends on her. To your
Yeah.
point, like it is kind of like her in a way more her movie. Like, and her character has a lot more to do because Jimmy Stewart learns nothing at all. Like he's still just a curmudgeon fool who, doesn't
Right.
really know what he has, and now he has both legs broken. Great. Like,
Oh yeah, that
he
too.
doesn't learn anything at
Yeah.
all. He makes the same mistake again. He gets injured and he's stuck in a chair. But she's at least had some excitement in her life. So
But
it's great.
maybe no change, right? And that's also a commentary. Like we don't really change.
Right.
If we do, it's very incremental over a long period of time.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean we can't step out and have, an adventure or an exciting. And maybe it does seep into us in some form, but also not really.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think she shouldn't be with him. Come on. Like
No.
she's so much better for him. It's like it's crazy, but
Yeah. Yeah.
what a great film. I'm glad we got to
So
talk
good.
about this. It's a great one.
All right. So what is your first love of Hitch?
My First Love is Psycho from 1960. Plot summary: a secretary on the run for embezzlement takes refuge at a secluded California motel owned by a repressed man and his overbearing mother. Directed by Hitchcock, starring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh. So another big masterpiece of his. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, when I was a kid, knowing of Hitchcock, I really associated him strongly with the suspense and horror genres. Just that was the iconography that I was absorbing like as a young kid. And I'd seen the TV show was on Nick at Night, so I'd watch that every so often, which is definitely a lot of horror stuff in there. But this movie, I knew it existed. I was afraid to see it when I was a kid. I knew it was going to scare me, even though it was an old movie in black and white. Like these are all things as a child you feel like mean it can't be good or can't be scary or what have you. And I remember finally, like, sort of getting up the courage, I guess you could say, to actually watching the movie. And it definitely did scare me and still does to this day. Like, it lived up to
Yeah.
what this in my mind, it was this thing that was going to be like the scariest movie. And, also my parents would talk about, oh, remember seeing that in theaters and it was so scary. So it was this thing built up in my mind. And Hitchcock, even though, like you were saying, he's fun, he has like a fun, like kind of macabre, dark sense of humor. I did always associate him with horror. So that made it even scarier. It's like, well, if he's like the master of horror, like this has got to be maybe the scariest movie ever made. And I saw it, as a young teen and loved it, and was scared by it. And it was hard for me to actually come back to it very often as a, until I was more an adult because it is so scary. It still scares me to this day. I think it's one of the scariest and creepiest movies in the way that he shot it. I think the black and white adds a lot of those elements. The score, we mentioned Bernard Herrmann. I think this is another just masterpiece in the
Mhm.
score. And there's a lot of other things I want to discuss when we get more into the movie itself. But I'm curious in terms of your first impressions. And did you have any, like I did, sort of expectation going into this, or did it have a reputation flying around? Maybe even when you were a kid, you said you knew of Hitchcock in India. I'm curious if this was one of the movies that was most associated with him for you.
I don't think I knew of this movie growing up, but yeah, as a teenager in my 20s, definitely knew it. And even once I started doing like a Hitchcock marathon of sorts, I avoided this movie for as long as I possibly could because of his reputation. And I was like, this is just too scary and too creepy. And horror is kind of not my genre
Right.
anyway.
Right.
So I just kind of avoided it. But then you watch it, and of course, it's scary. All those things that you know of, the shower sequence and what have you, it all lives up. It scares you, the jump squares and
Hmm.
the construction, the music, all of it works. But like with great horror movies, the few of them that I've seen, because I've not seen that many horror movies,
Yeah.
what really works is the psychology of it, like what is really going on and how creepy that is. And that's the stuff that stays with you. And so the same metaphor applies here as well, right? That you can come in and just be entertained by the jump scares and the thrills, or you could marvel at the movie making, or you could really wrestle with the psychology of what is happening, of relationships between sons and mothers, and just trauma and all sorts of things, which I'm sure we'll get into. So yeah, it works on all the levels. It really is a masterpiece in my mind. Like when I think of horror as a genre, or when I think of any kind of horror element in any movie made since, I always think of this movie. Like it's
Hmm.
sort of like a template. There are probably a few templatized movies in the horror genre. I'm no horror expert, but feels like this is definitely in that pantheon.
Absolutely. In terms of horror, it definitely was credited as creating the ground for the slasher movie. I mean, this is
Yeah.
really, you could make an argument this is the first one, even though there's been other sort of more like crystallized takes on it. And even down to the techniques of there's several point of view shots in this movie
Mm.
through the eyes of the killer, Anthony Perkins, when he's
Hmm.
peeping through the hole at her kind of getting changed. It's a first person point of view shot. And that is something that horror movies use all the time now.
Right.
Slasher movies, you're always seen from the point of view of the killer as, he or she's walking up on the victim, and Hitch is laying the groundwork for that too. And I think what also makes this movie scary for me, and actually might have been the reason why these types of movies are the scariest types of horror movies to me, is something we mentioned in our Long Legs episode, which was a couple episodes back, that
Hmm.
serial killers are terrifying to me. But once you start adding supernatural elements to it, I still love those types of movies, but they're not scary. And what
Right.
makes this movie, I think, so scary is this is a normal guy. I mean, he's not normal, but he
He's
doesn't have
not.
powers. He doesn't have any powers.
No.
It's the trauma that was
Right.
created in his life turned him into a killer, which can happen to anyone. And the
Yes.
situation is super normal. Someone just goes into a hotel and they're just checking in, nice guy there, whatever. It's like absolutely, it's again, it gets back to that ordinary circumstance with something extraordinary. But in this movie,
Right.
the extraordinary thing is, I don't want to say ordinary because psychopaths aren't ordinary, but it's human.
Yeah.
It's not anything supernatural. It's not a ghost. It's not, an alien. And that's what makes it so much more frightening to
And
me, at least.
effective.
And
Yeah.
effective, right? And
Yeah.
effective. And why I think as a kid it scared me and it still scares me today. And maybe is why I get scared more at those types of horror films than the ones with like,
Right.
a
Exactly.
supernatural being or a ghost or
Yeah.
something
Because it's
like that.
not real then. The stakes are
Right.
not immediately kind of brought down because you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is not real. But
Right.
like, this is real. It can
Mm-hmm.
happen to
Mm-hmm.
anybody, actually.
Right, right. And that is what might, and the ordinary, it's like she wasn't targeted for any particular reason in terms of the plot. I mean, I know you can say Hitchcock blonde and we can layer on all those things of why,
Hmm.
and the fact that she was, you could say she was committing a crime in the beginning of the movie.
Right.
The first half of the or the first third of the movie is the MacGuffin. It's an entire plot that just gets dropped almost immediately after
Hmm.
she gets killed. But you can say she's getting killed because she committed a crime, so it's like the penance and
Hmm.
bad people. But there's no real reason. He didn't target her. He didn't find her. She came to him and he's like, okay, like I'm gonna kill her. And that can happen also to anybody. Like she
Right.
didn't deserve this or cause this, I guess is kind of more what I'm trying to say. Just wrong person, wrong time. And
Exactly.
that could be anyone.
Exactly. Even though you could totally make a movie about what's going on with her, but
Hmm.
that's not the point. But it does matter. And that's sort of the nuance of his, right? Like you could have a MacGuffin that you throw away, but it has no deeper meaning or connectivity. But in all of his movies, even those things are thrown away, they are catalysts. They do kind of stay because you've seen this whole thing now, right? Like
Hmm.
you've seen this person commit a crime, have this kind of luxurious shower, trying to kind of wash her sins away, and
Hmm.
then be brutally murdered. You cannot not unsee that. You've
Right.
seen it now, right?
Hmm.
You're a part of it. And that's the other thing too. Like he's always playing with the audience. You've seen this now. So how can you sort of now just go about your normal life? You cannot. You're in it now. And that is why what happened to her, it matters, but it doesn't matter because now the world has changed. It's
Right.
almost like life before that and life after that.
Right, right. Similar to the last movies we discussed too, there's no, there's a it's not a mystery for the audience. You know what happened, and now you're just
Mm-hmm.
watching the other characters, and the suspense is: are they going to get killed? Which some of them
Right.
do. Are they going to find out? I guess the mystery is sort of why Norman is the way he is, and
That
that
is a
that
mystery. Yeah.
that is actually a mystery that you are invested in because you're like, what is going on? Like, is it the mom? If it's not, like, is it him? Why is it him? And then they give you enough that you can understand it, but they don't make it about that either. And a lot of the credit, I think, too, is due to Anthony Perkins' just absolutely incredible performance in this movie as
Totally.
Norman Bates, that he can play a normal guy, a troubled guy, and then a psycho. Like all in just sort of one
Mhm.
performance and make it believable that this could happen to, a person that goes through that break because of all the things that he saw with his parents and what his mom did and his dad did and all the things they kind of hint at in the movie. But he is just absolutely the older I've gotten, the more I can appreciate the acting and what he's giving to this role instead of just be like scared of him.
Exactly. Yeah. Which again is sort of the brilliance of, I guess, Hitch, but also the actors he chose, right? Like this movie could just hang on the jump scares and the way the MacGuffin is treated, the technical brilliance. But if this performance is not grounding the entire piece, it wouldn't be a masterpiece.
Hmm.
The tone of the movie would be different. And there's just so many layers. Like you have to be on this journey with him to keep trying to guess what is going on with you. And you get glimpses, but you're never really sure. It's probably one of the most unsettling performances I've ever seen put on screen.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on the ending of the movie where stuff is sort of spelled out, which is atypical of Hitchcock, but I'm sure there's like a studio reason or something, you know.
Spelled out and like explaining,
Yeah,
oh, what happened to Norman. And well, it is interesting in terms of the MacGuffin part though. They drop sort of the investigation into the money and
right.
Marion getting killed and things. It's like all about Perkins. And the very last shot is they just cut to, okay, the car's getting out of the water, so maybe they found it. They don't explain the resolution of the MacGuffin part, but they
Hmm.
definitely do explain, to your point, more of Norman. And I think
Right.
without that context, and then I think the last shot of him in the police holding cell where he just like looks up at the camera and gives this just psychopathic look and stare and smile, it's just
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. But I
Oh,
think you need the cops to make it feel ordinary again at the end, to make you afraid that, wait a second, this is just, there is no supernatural element. It wasn't the mom come back from the dead. You understand why he was quote unquote created, and then that is more terrifying because again, that could happen to anyone, or could be, there could be a lot of Norman Bateses being created out there too. So I think without that context is sort of my take on it. It wouldn't be as scary because there'd be almost too much ambiguity, and the matter of factness of, oh, he was traumatized as a child because of this and now he turned into a killer. That is more terrifying than if they were didn't really explain kind of what happened. But what is your take to that? Because you're right, it is a bit of an information dump by the cops at
yeah.
the end.
I mean, looking at it from like, sitting here now, it sort of feels maybe a little too much of exposition dump
Hmm.
because yes, you need that context, but I don't know if it needed to be spelled out that literally. I mean, I'm sure Hitch is capable of communicating and conveying that in kind of a more subtle way that this is not supernatural. This is what happened without really sort of spelling it out the way it
Mm.
is. That said, though, I was reading about this and thinking about like when this movie came out, you know, psychiatry and psychology and mental health and all of this stuff was probably still pretty new,
Mm.
so
True. Right. Or frowned upon or thought was
or
weird and
frowned upon or
people. Right.
whatever.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
our understanding into the human mind and psychology was still evolving, still is evolving. So maybe at that time it needed to be spelled out even more, just
Mm.
so people really understood it, because otherwise you wouldn't. So in that sense, I think it makes sense. But yeah, just viewing it from today's lens, it did feel a little much because it does take you out of the movie, I think. Versus if it were just explain, I mean, I'm no Hitch, obviously, who can be.
I thought you were in the beginning of the episode. You fooled me.
True, exactly. But yeah, if he had just done it like a way that you understand it, but it's not spelled out, I just feel like you will walk away, with like a slightly
Mm.
different head on your shoulders.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if part of it too, perhaps, was that the whole tone of this movie and sort of what he was going after was making like a B horror picture. Like he this was supposed to kind of be his take on like a trashy,
Hmm.
horror novel, which is why it does feel kind of cheap and exploitative a little bit, like an exploitation film,
Mhm.
but elevated because he's Hitchcock, he's elevated it. But I think the sort of the trappings of what you would need to do in a story like that, of just spell it out at the end, is sort of part of the formula, and maybe that is also something that he's playing around with. But then also, I think you could say this invented that formula in a way too. I mean, it's a police procedural mixed with like a serial killer film, and how many times has this been done now? A,
Yep.
a million. Like whole careers are built on people trying to rip this movie off. Or I shouldn't say that because that sounds cheap, but are influenced by this movie to start
Influenced
their
by
whole
it. Yeah.
careers is more of kind of what's going on here. So I wonder if that is sort of part of it, where he's not making like a Spellbound, or which is his other film about like psychology, or his more of a, he's trying to go after the higher art thing, especially at the time too. Horror was not seen as anything respectable whatsoever. So the
Yeah.
fact that he was even doing this was, it was hard to get finance in, I think, for this film too. Like, no, he had to cut the budget way down. Like studios weren't like,
Oh yeah.
why are you making a movie based on this really trashy book? Like, this is ridiculous. You're Alfred Hitchcock. Like, you just made Northwest, and Rear Window. Like, what are you doing? But I think he was just, again, his brilliance. He saw like what he could do with this story and change the game forever. I mean, that the thing about this movie too, that is just every time I see it, like much like Northwest and a lot of the Hitch movies, is it feels so modern because
Mm-hmm.
he created modern blockbuster cinema, or and that we're still craving from so much of this stuff. It doesn't feel like a quote unquote older movie that's paced in a
Mm-hmm.
certain way, that is acted in a certain way, that is shot in a certain way. It just feels like this could have been made this year.
Yeah.
It, especially that shower scene, just, it's
Oh,
hard to understand how revolutionary that was in terms of the fast cutting and everything, because we're so used to that now. But that does feel like something anyone could have shot this year and put into a movie, and it would still be just as effective. And I think that's just, again, the thing that every time I see a Hitch movie, I'm just struck by how it just feels like it was made yesterday. Like when you
oh.
listen to a good song from a long time ago and you're like, oh, this could, like a Beatles track. It's like, oh, someone could have made this today. It doesn't feel, feels timeless. I think that is Hitch. And this movie especially. Not all of his movies,
Yeah.
but this one and North and Northwest as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. I know we've covered several masterpieces already, but this is the masterpiece category now. What is your masterpiece for Hitchcock? I mean, there's so many to choose from. What are you giving
Uh,
us today?
they keep coming.
Yeah.
But my official pick for his masterpiece is Notorious from 1946, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, of course, starring Cary Grant, Ingrid Bergman, Claude Rains. Quick logline: the daughter of a convicted German spy is asked by American agents to gather information on a ring of German scientists in South America. How far will she have to go to ingratiate herself with them? I think I watched this movie in my Hitchcock marathon. And I think of all of his movies, of course, this has all the elements that we've been talking about, amazing production, technical brilliance, playing with the audiences and their minds, just an entertaining movie up front. But I love this movie, and why it's my masterpiece is because this is, I think, Hitchcock's perfect blending of all of what he does so well in the mold of a Casablanca or, a golden age Hollywood movie. And I love that kind of movie. And this sort of feels like his version of that, but it has all the trappings of a Hitchcock movie. And that's what I love about it. Like we've talked a lot about the mind and desire and the head and the dark side and maybe even humor, of course, the dark side of it. But we haven't really talked about love and heart
Hmm.
in Hitch's context. And I think this is one of the few movies where that is at play. It's it's sort of, I don't know, kind of moving and refreshing to see Cary Grant in the very beginning sort of be head over heels over Ingrid Bergman. There is true love over there. And I guess the MacGuffin in like a sad and a dark way is that you have to now kind of pawn your love to go do this terrible thing that could, put her life in danger. And you have to live through that. And that is the driving force of the movie and whatever Cary Grant does and puts his own life in danger. So yeah, that part kind of really, I mean, I could have almost put this in a wild card category because you don't see a lot of heart from Hitchcock, but I love that this is kind of in the middle of all the other trappings of, Hitch's treatment. So yeah, we can go more into the movie, but yeah, what is your relationship with Notorious? And I should say, like, this is in my like top 5 favorite movies of all time. So, and this is how much I love this movie.
Yeah, and you brought this into our first Love of Film episode way back in the
Exactly.
first couple sets. So I'll post the link to that below so people can hear you gush about
Yeah.
how that film impacted your love of film. But for me as well, this is a 10 out of 10 film. I think Hitchcock has several of these, and this is definitely one of them. And I saw this for the first time in the Hitchcock class, so I came to this much later. It's not,
Mm,
I think, one of his more, I don't know, pop culturally relevant movies. Like it's not a Northwest or a Psycho or a Birds or Rear Window. So I don't know if I'd even heard of it as a teenager. And I
mm,
remember seeing it in the film class and just being completely enthralled. I was like, is this my favorite Hitchcock movie now? Like I remember seeing it the first time, be like, how did I not know this existed? How was something this good out there that I never came across? But yeah, I think the interesting take on here, and yes, he has done love stories before, but this is almost like his twisted version of a love story where
mm-hmm.
their love is being tested by the fact that he's basically pimping her out to this other guy, and she has to pretend that she's in love with somebody else and be with somebody else and marry somebody else to do this espionage for the US government. And that's the twisted way that their love is being tested. And then you wonder through the whole movie, the suspense is like, are they going to end up together? Is their love going to survive this?
Right.
Yes, you do care about the piece of the espionage, the MacGuffin plot of trying to figure out what this guy, is doing, Claude Rains, but it's really the suspense is what's going to happen to this relationship because it's such an
Yeah.
odd situation. And I mean, both these performances from the two leads, Bergman and Cary Grant, are just so amazing what they have
Uh,
to go through and portray, but in this more classic acting style. Like this
yeah.
isn't if this movie was made in like the 80s or whatever, there'd be these big emotional scenes like, oh, you're tearing me apart, Lisa, like that kind of stuff. Where it'd be more like you'd see it where they can't express it so much. and it's more kind of buttoned up. But I think that makes this movie more interesting to me, especially from an acting standpoint, because they can't
Hmm.
be in that bigger acting style that became popular later, right? So
Yeah,
that
there's no like here's looking at you, kid,
right,
or
or that either.
there'll
Yeah,
always be Paris. Like there's none of that in
right,
this. As much
right.
as I love that too,
Oh,
but
yeah, I
yeah,
love Casablanca, but you're right, it's
yeah,
not. That Hitch wouldn't do that. That's not
no.
him, right? And this is how he portrays love in a way that he's twisted and yeah, it's manipulative and maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
what Hitchcock feels that love is.
Mm-hmm.
Twisted manipulation and how much can you push trust? Because that's kind of another theme of this movie too. Questioning your trust in a relationship. It's all of that is around this plot of espionage. But again,
Yeah,
it's like that's what's so fascinating about what Hitch can do.
yeah. And as if that weren't enough, you then have another third element in this triangle in Claude Rains,
Hmm.
which is kind of iconic in a way that yes, this person is of the Nazi party and bad stuff is happening, or at least has allegiance with the Nazi
Yeah, he's a
party
bad
and
guy.
bad
He's the
stuff
bad.
is
He's the bad
he's a
guy. Yeah.
baddie.
Hmm.
But the way Claude Rains performs it and the way the story takes place, like you almost start empathizing with this person. And that's sort of the other angle, because you do feel that Claude Rains' character actually does love Ingrid Bergman. There is something there for
Absolutely.
real,
Oh, yeah. For
you
him,
know?
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talk about putting love to test. Like that's why this movie kind of feels like something else to me, because even the baddie struggle is with love too, where he's sort of trapped with his own love towards Ingrid Bergman, and his downfall also happens because he, leans in a little too much on the love side, even though he's obviously hurting her, and this is all a ruse to begin with. So yeah, this is his only movie where the central driving force is love and how it pushes people and messes people up, and
It's
it's kind of
yeah.
brilliant.
I mean, it's you really can say it's bad, right? Because if Cary Grant didn't fall in love with Bergman, it'd be very easy for him to be like, okay, go,
Go
deal
do
with
this.
this
Yeah.
guy. And if Claude Rains wasn't in love with Bergman, he wouldn't have let her in so much that she caught him in terms of what he was doing. Yeah, she helped discover that he was smuggling the uranium or whatever. I don't remember the
Yeah,
specific
who
plot, but
cares?
his allegiance to the Nazi party was damaged because of the love that he had for her. He was blinded by that love. And then he's forced to basically kill her. And
Yeah.
by his mom, again, bad mother, manipulative
Yeah,
mother
bad
character,
mother.
but he has to be there poisoning the woman that he loves because he has to save his own skin because he doesn't want to get discovered by the Nazis. So I think Hitchcock's statement, if this is his statement on love, and I can't really think off the top of my head other movies of his that really dealt with love a lot. I'm sure there are others. Again, we're not scholars here, but it's pretty dark opinion
Yeah.
of love, honestly. This is not a it's not a thing that brings you joy. It's a thing that brings you betrayal and brings you pain and makes you do things you don't want to do.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
good. This is
No.
what the message of this movie is. Love is
Yeah.
bad.
Or at least love is hard.
Hard.
It's not a bed of
Okay.
roses,
Right. Well,
and
definitely
you
not.
have
Yeah.
to pay a price for it, and you
Hmm.
have to uphold. And that's the test, like you said. How far will you go? But for us audiences, there's a lot of joy in the movie because of the way it's staged. I think this is, in
Hmm.
my mind, I guess Rebecca falls in that category as well. But this movie just feels just so grand. It has that kind of golden age of Hollywood sheen. And, we cannot talk about this movie and not talk about the shot from in that party, from bird's eye view
Oh God,
to
yeah.
focusing all the way on the key in her hand in the back as she's hugging Claude Rains's character. I mean, that's the poster of the movie, but that scene is absolutely brilliant technically, but also
Hmm.
just so symbolic and iconic that in the sea of people and the grandeur, you zoom in, and here is sort of the center of you're alone and you're terrified and you don't know what's going to happen, and you have this key that
Hmm.
could get you out. Will it work? Won't it work? Like that, the entire movie is summed in that entire shot, which is just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, right. From a technical level, but then
Yeah.
also like it hits the theme and that's the suspense. Like now the
Yeah.
audience is like, oh, she's in this whole scene, and then that one element of the key either is going to be saving her or
Mm-hmm.
getting her caught. That shot is the highlight of the movie for sure. I anticipate it every time I watch this. I'm like, I can't wait to get to that moment. But this whole movie is just fantastic. And again, I don't think maybe it is his reputation is bigger maybe now, but I don't think it's as well
Yeah.
known to the, a layman as some of the other movies we've been talking about before. So in a way, it's kind of a hidden gem potentially for some people who might be listening. And hopefully we didn't ruin too much of the plot. And but
Yeah.
again, it kind of doesn't matter. It's one of those movies where every time I watch it, I'm like, oh yeah, what exactly is going on with the thing that they're trying to do? And but again,
Same
it
thing. You
doesn't
forget
matter.
about it,
You forget about it, right? But I
Yeah.
would highly recommend folks watch this. And actually, I think I might have mentioned this in the last time we discussed this movie too, but Mission Impossible 2, which is also one of my favorite movies, is essentially a remake of this. In terms of the plot, it's basically the same plot that I also think they obviously I'm not comparing the two in terms of the quality, though I do love MI2, but it just shows again the lasting effect of Hitchcock, where these formulas of what this movie sets out can be remade and redone because it just works so well.
Yeah.
He's Hitchcock.
Yeah. It's timeless. All right. So what is your masterpiece?
So my masterpiece is North Northwest, which we already talked about. So if folks want to hear that again, they can rewind the episode. But there's really nothing more. I mean, there's a lot more we can say. No, not more we'll say in this episode. Now we're moving on to our final category, which is wild card. So again, this is some other element of Hitchcock that we want to discuss today. So why don't you start on your wild card? Karan, what do you got for
All
us?
right. So my wild card is The Lady Vanishes from 1938, directed, of course, by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Margaret Lockwood, Michael Redgrave, Paul Lucas. Quick logline on the movie: while traveling in continental Europe, a rich young playgirl realizes that an elderly lady seems to have disappeared from the train. So I had to include something from his British period before he kind of came to Hollywood, and there's so many gems in that era as well. Like I love the Marlena Dietrich one, Stage Door, and Sabotage, and
Mm-hmm.
you know,
39
39
Steps. That's one
Steps,
of my
and
favorites. Yeah. Foreign
exactly
Correspondent, I almost put
Foreign
on here too.
Correspondent.
That's one
I
of my favorite
almost
movies of all time.
put
Yeah.
that somewhere as well, but
Yeah.
I guess that wouldn't really be a wild card because that really falls into all of his
I,
stuff. But
yeah, yeah.
this one, I think this is as close as Hitchcock comes to like a comedic farce kind of a movie. Like the
Mm-hmm.
first like 30 minutes of the movie when they're in the ski lodge trap, like it's like a full-on comedy movie. There are
Oh,
gags
yeah.
in there, and stuff with the staff and the girls and their luggage that's coming in and the maid. And it's like quite charming and funny, and not in like a dark, twisted way, but it's just plain life funny,
Yeah, yeah.
and you sort of are unclear of what's even happening, for a while until when the plot starts to kind of unroll of the vanishing of this lady. And again, if Hitchcock made this movie or remade this movie, I guess in the 60s, I think it'll be a much darker movie for sure.
Mm,
But this
mm-hmm.
just stands out to me because it's such a light and breezy movie. The performances are great. And so yeah, it's kind of like a comedic caper of sorts. Now it's of course it's Hitchcock, so there's more underneath the layers, as always, where you can think more. But I think to me, this is a wild card because it just stands on itself as like a comedic farce, like I said. So that's why I put this as my wild card. Had you watched this movie before?
Yeah, so I had seen this before. I saw this during my Hitchcock class. So I had actually
Mm.
not been exposed to the British period that you mentioned until taking the class. I'd only seen Hitch's American films, and not to group them kind of all together, but I did feel that there this fun tone is through a lot
Mm-hmm.
of them that is sometimes not as those other movies when he made in the States not necessarily have a lot of the humor. And I think that is it, and this movie especially really works. So there's some of them don't. The Trouble with
Mm-hmm.
Harry is more of an outright comedy. The movie is not good really at all. But this sense of fun, especially like you said in the first act of the movie, where it just feels like just the almost like a lead up to like a screwball comedy where you meet all the different
Mm-hmm.
people and they're going to be stuck on a train now. Oh, this is going to be really fun and like what hijinks are going to happen. And if it's Hitchcock, so of course the hijinks is a disappearance, potential murder of this woman, and then what's going on there. But what makes this movie work is not only Hitchcock, I do think is very good at humor. Honestly, like maybe not broad comedy per se, but
Right.
his films do have a very usually darkly comedic tone. I mean, I even remember as a kid watching the Hitchcock TV series when he would come on and do his little bits. They were always comedy bits and really dark, twisted kind of like dark humor. But this movie isn't necessarily that either. It's not dark, but the comedy really works because of the characters. The characters are really fun. I really love like those two like foppish English guys that are, obsessed with cricket and they're trying to go to the show. They're cool. Like the main characters are fun and interesting. Even the old lady who goes missing, like in the beginning, you're like, oh, she's gonna play some like goofy role of being some old lady. But then, the plot thickens as you say, and then it turns into a sort of more of a suspense mystery on the train, like a confined space movie. What's going on, and are
Right.
are people being gaslit? And this is an example where the audience doesn't really know
Hmm.
actually at all. But yeah, I would say the old lady's not is maybe you could say that she's a MacGuffin kind of, or this is more of just a straightforward mystery movie that still really works.
Yeah.
You do care about the plot and it's a lot simpler to follow, especially once you kind of realize what's going on. But I think it's a fun movie and nice to bring it into the conversation too. And there's some other things that I learned in the class that was interesting too
Mm.
that I can get into if we kind of as we dive more into the film, that was just another sort of take on what this film's trying to say that I definitely wouldn't have picked up on if I hadn't been taught that. And
Mm.
then now every time I go back and watch it, this is all that I can see in this
Oh,
movie.
I'm very curious to hear. On the mystery part, I agree, like it's straightforward. However, I always do forget about what happened. I know she vanishes, but
Oh,
I
like
always
the
forget what
mechanics of
happened.
how yeah, like
Yeah.
where she's being hidden and who all the players are. Right.
Yeah.
That's true, actually. I can't recall it right now. And I just saw the movie
No,
last week.
exactly. And that's sort of his genius, right? That you're always, kind of along for the ride. Curious, what was the theory you heard?
Oh, so that this movie was I can't remember the exact year, but it was late 30s. It was made, and this was during the rise of Nazi Germany, but before like England was still trying to appease Hitler and not get into go into the Europe and try to stop what Hitler was doing, basically spreading the Nazi empire throughout Europe, and that the lady, quote unquote, in the movie represents England. Like she's very much like a Queen
Uh,
Victoria type character who vanishes. Like we need England. Europe needs England. Like what's going on? Like why can't you come and help save us from the fascists? The villains in this movie are very like Nazi coded and
mm-hmm.
German coded. There's one character too in the movie that is always sort of like the coward. He's like, no, we can negotiate with these guys. We can negotiate.
Right.
And then the second that he goes out and tries to negotiate with the bad guys, he immediately gets killed. And at the
Mm,
time, there was this big appeasement movement of all these people saying like, well, we can just negotiate with Hitler. It's okay. Well, I don't want to go to war again. We just had World War One. Let's just try to
right.
work something out. And this movie is basically saying, you're going to get killed. You can't negotiate with these guys. These are the bad guys. We have to find, Lady Britain and actually go and try to save Europe. So this because of this time, there's these arguments kind of going back and forth, I guess, in Britain of like, how do we want to get involved? In the States too, but in Britain, it was a lot more prescient because the Nazis are like right across the channel as opposed to across the
Mhm.
ocean. So every time I see this movie now, I try to like think, okay, what is this character must represent this part of
Mm,
the argument. Bad guys definitely appear as Nazis. Like now I can't
mm,
unsee it. So that they were teaching us that at the class, and that's like now all that I view this movie at, which is it's like a political film in a way, which
right.
Hitch doesn't really tend to do. But he was someone who definitely was pro stopping Hitler. And this movie is sort of saying that without kind of outright coming out and saying it, but the subtext is there to what he's trying to do with this movie.
Checks out. I don't know how much he was thinking about it versus this is just theories that
Yeah,
have been, built over time,
right.
but it does check out and probably it was on his mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you
Yeah.
put it into your art, right? You want to make some sort of statement, but he also has to entertain. So there's like an entertaining story around this, but the story has a message. But instead of being about love or all the things we're talking about,
Yeah.
I was like, hey guys, we got to go out there and get the Germans. They're not going to stop until they
Yeah.
take over the world.
Last thing I want to say, which is very true for a lot of the British period movies, that they always begin in like this miniature recreation of the actual
Yes.
set. I love
Yes.
that so much.
Yes.
And this one, it's sort of the whole train station and the ski lodge and everything. And I mean, I want all of those for my collection. Not that I have a collection of miniatures, but that would be so amazing. I've always loved like miniatures that are drawn or recreated to that level of detail, and it's just so great. I mean, and it. I mean, I don't know. At that point, were they really trying to make this come off as like a real thing? probably that's the best thing they had. I mean,
Hmm.
at this point, you obviously know it's not, but it adds just so much charm. And it's almost like, the opening of a book. Like the book
Hmm.
has like an illustration of sorts of what's to come. That's how I take these now. And I love that so much.
Yeah, me too. And actually, that's something we haven't mentioned at all throughout this conversation yet is just Hitchcock pushing the boundaries of like visual effects in movies.
Right.
Like, there's so many of his movies had incredible special effects sequences, and I count this as sort of this is a special effect in a
Yeah.
sense. The model and this tracking shot through the model, and yeah, I wonder how much of it he knew. This is supposed to look a little bit quaint, maybe to set the tone of the movie, like again,
Mm,
you said opening a pop-up book or something, a little storybook beginning to this little Europe before the Nazis kind of thing.
hmm.
I don't know if that was how much of that was intentional, but definitely like it struck me on this rewatch too. It's like, oh yeah, these model shots are amazing. And then remembering, oh yeah, Hitchcock is a special effects director. He's like a Jim Cameron, but
Right.
back then, pushing the boundaries of effects for story purposes, but not letting the effects take over what the story is. But I mean, so many of these effects in these movies and these action sequences were just revolutionary at the time and must have blown people away, just like going to Pandora or the Death Star trench run in Star Wars or something that big because they hadn't seen it before. And that's just awesome. So I'm glad you brought that up because that definitely is something that struck me, especially on this watch too. It's like, oh, this is so cute. What a great, I'm sort of in the right mood for what this movie has, at
Yeah.
least in the
It's very
beginning.
cozy because of that,
Cozy.
I
Yeah, that's
think.
a great, yeah. Miniatures are cozy. I don't know
Yeah.
why.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Cozy and Hitchcock are not two words that you would think of, hence the wild card,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
is a segue to what is your wild card?
So my wild card is the movie Rope from 1948. The plot summary: two men try to convince themselves they've committed the perfect murder by hosting a dinner party after strangling a former classmate to death. Obviously, directed by Hitchcock, starring James Stewart, John Dahl, and Farley Granger. I wanted to bring in a film to me that really exemplifies in the best way Hitchcock's sense of gimmicks. Like, and he does do gimmicks, and that is
Hmm.
something that he does. Gimmick in this movie, from a technical standpoint, is it feels like it's all one continuous shot, other than one, two clear edit points in the film. But as an audience member, you're supposed to feel like this is a oneer, one long oneer, right? The whole movie is one shot, which back in the day was technically not possible because the film cameras could only hold like 10 or 15 minutes of film.
Mm,
So they couldn't actually do it. But that is a gimmick of a movie that very easily could be distracting or something that could say, oh, Hitchcock only just does like fun gimmicks like a 3D or smell-o-vision or those movies where like the chair would vibrate or something. Like these are all sort of gimmicks, but Hitchcock is able to do gimmicks in a lot of his movies, and special effects would be one of them, that comment on the plot, like they fit the theme of what the movie is. And it's just something too that because you're not distracted by it, but you know that it's happening, it just to me at least works on like another level. You don't feel cheap, like, oh, I know what he's trying to do here. It's like, whoa, I know what he's trying to do here. Like, I'm going to kind of pay attention to this. And I wanted to bring in something that is more technical of what he's achieved in film, because I think that's something that is easily forgotten by mainstream of the technical bounds that he was pushing. We'll get into the film a little bit more because it definitely is an interesting one. Had you seen Rope before?
I watched this when I was doing my Hitchcock marathon. I think the gimmick, not just of the oneer, but also just of the conceit that, oh, this has happened right in the beginning of the movie. And
Yeah,
now
right. Yeah,
let's
right, right.
see, if you get caught or no. It's actually pretty clever, but I will say this is not one of my favorites of Hitch's. I mean, there are some movies that I probably dislike more of his. You mentioned one of them. But this one, after a while, I think the gimmick of the actual conceit or the premise does get a little bit tired in my mind, especially as Jimmy Stewart enters, and also Jimmy Stewart is on his ham best in this movie. It's like a lot. Like this is sort of where, as we said before, like he's not an actor's director. I think he sort of probably lets the actors come in and do what they want to do. And this is Jimmy Stewart's interpretation, I suppose, of this character, where even though I don't know if he knows he's playing a gay character, but he probably is.
I think he knows. I
He
think
probably
so.
knows.
Yeah.
And maybe that's sort of what this movie has been reduced to now, I guess, is that of its sort of really overt homosexual tones,
Mm.
which is fascinating to kind of watch. And And I do love that aspect that, Hitchcock has always played with sexuality and desire and the dark side of that. And he's not limited to just straight relationships. He sort of casts a wide net in terms
Hmm.
of that, that exploration across, no matter who you are. So I do love that aspect. But otherwise, as a movie, it's the movie that I think is in the pop culture consciousness now, because at least, in the film Twitter letterboxed world that we live in, thanks to
Mm.
that. But
Oh, the
I,
homosexual elements, you mean?
or just
That
this movie in general,
Oh, okay,
but
okay, okay.
because of those elements, it's in the
Hmm.
cultural consciousness. But it's the one that I probably rewatch the least, because I do find at some point it gets a bit tired, I think.
Yeah, like I'm not saying this is the one movie we've talked about. Well, actually, Lady Vanishes isn't like a 10 out of 10 either, but that is, I like this movie a lot,
Right.
but it's not one of my favorite Hitchcocks. But I think it is because it is most experimental film. When I watch it, those are the elements that I pay attention to a lot of trying to think, oh, wow, so they had to move the camera because it's not just like a single shot where the camera's not moving. The camera's moving in and out of rooms and
Right.
situations. And I think Jimmy Stewart even said at some point, like all the rehearsals are basically just not for the actors. It was only just for the camera because they had to do so much rehearsals on where that camera's going, at what point they swap out, the film, where are they going to do the edits. Like it was incredibly, incredibly planned there, and the special effects of the background, like they're in an apartment
Right.
with all these windows on the side, and you can see the New York City skyline, and throughout the party, because the movies has to be in real time too, because it's one supposed to be one shot. The gradually, like the sun is setting and the lights are
Right.
coming on and the smoke and how they're timing all of that. I over focus on those elements because it just fascinates me on how he actually did this. So that
Yeah.
keeps my interest because yeah, like the basic premise of this is just there's a murder and will the murderers get caught, and they think they're the perfect murder. I mean that story's been done like a billion times. And there's some interesting twists in it. Again, the fact that you can lay over the gay overtones of it too, make it a little different and unique, but it's that experimental part of it that keeps
Hmm.
me interested, even though, yes, the plot, if it didn't have the gimmick, I'll say it that way, I don't think this movie would be as
Right.
fun for me to rewatch. But I focus so much on that, like the technical things that he's doing here. It's
Yeah.
definitely like the most technical movie he's done. Cause the whole movie is that. It's
The
not
whole
just
movie is
one
that.
one
Yeah.
sequence or something like a lifeboat where you're on one set. It's like, okay,
Right.
that's cool and interesting and fun to see how he does that. But this is even pushing that to the limit because of all the camera movements you have to do, the zooms, the dolly shots. It's incredibly impressive. Like I'd love to actually see footage of them filming this. I mean, maybe there is somewhere.
Yeah.
I should track it down on YouTube. But just like what that set looked like, what his
Oh,
plans looked like, when the camera was moving, like what was that like for the actors jumping out of the way, coming in here. I mean, it's like a stage play, but to the nines.
I think that part is just absolutely fascinating. And as you were talking about it, I'm thinking about even more and more. Like, yeah, it's like a stage play, perfectly choreographed with precision of almost like an architectural design
Hmm.
masterpiece that you have to create, because it's not just the camera. I mean, there are people in there, there are scenes happening, there's a lot of acting happening, like I
Yeah.
said earlier, and you have to do all of that while keeping all the technicalities of it, enrich the story, but also not get in the way. And
Right.
that's very hard to do.
Right, right. And make it feel not distracting.
Right.
I think you can easily watch this movie and people probably if you hadn't told them they're trying to do one shot, you might not even
Don't
realize
even
it.
think about it.
But
Yeah.
it's effective in sort of building the suspense. You can choose to be just focus on that instead of be distracted by it. That's the perfect balance that he's not calling drawing attention to it, I guess is
Yeah.
another thing of doing some really showy kind of like one shot like Goodfellas
Right.
entering in the club, like what's going on, and that's what Scorsese's trying to get out of you. Hitchcock, it's not meant to show off. Yeah, like I think this is a movie that is fun, especially as people if they're focused more on the how movies are made and the production elements and knowing
Hmm.
that history. I definitely recommend seeing this. If you're just trying to have a fun time, I think you'll have that, but I wouldn't
Right.
say run out and see Rope. It's one of Hitchcock's best movies of all time. It's not, but I still think it's a really strong piece of his canon, and especially from a
Agreed.
technical element, it shows why he was just a brilliant, brilliant technician.
Gosh, we could just keep talking about so many more of his movies, but
I know.
that's our Hitchcock set.
We're not
Um,
going to cover what we want to do next. What happened to that segment?
I know. Well, actually, that's a good hypothetical thing.
Oh,
If he
oh
were
yeah, actually. Oh,
around,
interesting. Yeah, what if he
what
was
would
still
he?
around?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know what he would be, because the thing is, like, he invented all these genres already. I think there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't much, and as you saw from the second, like, sort of the end of his career, he definitely, ran out of creative steam in his last decade.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're thinking about Hitchcock at kind of the top of his game, I think he would be working in whatever was the latest form of entertainment and suspense. Maybe he's doing TikTok videos.
Oh my
I mean,
gosh.
seriously, like maybe he's inventing how to bring narrative into to short form. Or he definitely would be doing something online. I think digital, he would have a lot of fun with what he could do with that. The special effects that he
Yeah.
could, the visual effects at least. Like I would again, I think he'd handle that like a Jim Cameron or a George Lucas, where you're pushing the technology forward. I think he'd come up with amazing things that we would never have dreamed of in those areas too. So that is what I focus more on in terms of what he would be doing today, because I think narrative wise, like he did it all in the medium of film. So where else would he go? What other mediums would he be in? I'd follow him in TikTok.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think? What do you think he would be
Yeah, I
doing?
guess Lady Vanishes made me think that what if at the peak of his powers in the 60s, I mean, if you're assuming that that's the version of Hitchcock that's around now and making
Hmm.
movies, I would love for him to make a version of a romance or a comedy movie now, almost like coming
Mm.
a bit of a full circle back to his like British phase.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
that would be fun. I mean, it wouldn't be the same because it'll be darker, but something with a little bit more heart. Like, I think that would be pretty interesting to see. And then the other idea that came in mind was like take on the Bond franchise. And we
Oh
live in a
yeah.
world of franchises, and he obviously created and in many ways can be thanked for that of what we view as Bond movies and I guess Mission Impossible movies to be. So that'll be fun.
Oh yeah. I definitely put him on a Bond for sure. That would. I think he'd want to do it. Why not?
Yeah.
He'd love it.
Yeah.
In terms of next episode, we're taking an episode off, so we're taking a bit of a break. Life kind of gets in the way. Both of us are getting kind of busy on our end, but we will be back with the return of Tim Burton to our screens with the new Beetlejuice film, Beetlejuice. So that episode will be dropping on the 18th of September. So in
Yeah.
roughly about three or 4 weeks.
Excited for that. But until then, we really hope you enjoyed this discussion on Hitchcock. Let us know what you thought of our picks. Were there other movies that, are your favorites? Like, this is such an iconic director that I feel like everybody has their own favorite Hitchcock movies. So that'll be really fun to hear. But as always, we are available here on YouTube as well as other podcasting platforms. So please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And also, please rate us and review us because that really helps new listeners find us. Until then, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.